Jimmy Akin is here with me on the show. Jimmy Akin is a senior apologist at Catholic Answers. I love Catholic Answers. Those who watch the show know this because I refer to Catholic Answers frequently. Jimmy, welcome to the show. I did not realize until today, though, that you have not always been Catholic, that you are a convert.
Mhm.
Tell me about that. What did you convert from?
Well, I converted from conservative Protestantism. I had been a member of the Presbyterian Church in America, which is a conservative Presbyterian denomination, but I made a point of studying the theology of all different groups of Christians. I had planned on becoming a seminary professor, and I realized once I had a conversion to Christ at age 20, that what church is in good drive-in distance or has a preacher I like or a youth group I like or music I like, none of those are good tests for theological truth. So I'd made a point of studying the theology of all different branches of Christianity, even though I myself was a conservative Protestant. And one day I made a discovery in the reading the passage in Matthew 16 about you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And I suddenly realized there are structure, even though I'd always argued Peter is not the rock, and I had arguments for that, I suddenly realized there were structural features in the text that are so obvious they're even there in English. You don't have to go to the Greek, that demand that Peter be the rock. So I had to change my view on that. And if Peter's the rock on which Jesus builds his church, that means once Jesus goes back to heaven, Peter's in charge. And whoever's in charge of the earthly church in the absence of Jesus, that's a description of the office of the Pope. So I needed to take time to review all of the areas of systematic theology with an open mind to the Catholic position. Now, whether there were meant to be later popes was a separate question I had to answer, but I had to admit that Catholics were right, that Peter can be described as the first pope. And so that led to my conversion, which was over 30 years ago now. And so now I'm not only a senior apologist, I'm the senior apologist and even the senior employee at Catholic Answers. I've been there longer than anyone else.
So you could describe yourself if you wanted as the boss over there.
No, I'm not the boss, but I am the longest standing apologist and employee, and it's been a very interesting more than 30 years working in apologetics ministry, defending the Christian faith.
Who do you see as being the top contenders for who might become the next pope?
Well, there are lists of people that have been discussed as possible next popes. These are known as papabile, which is Italian for popable. You could make this person pope. And these candidates tend to have a prominent public profile. They tend to be known, at least among Catholics, before an election happens, and the electors, the cardinals who do the election, they look for certain characteristics that different candidates have, who they think might be good as pope, because you need a unique set of skills to be pope. You need, for example, the ability to communicate well. You need to communicate in a pastoral style that people will appreciate. You need to have a sharp theological mind. You need to have a sharp legal mind to be able to navigate canon law, and which is the church's internal rule system. You need to have strong faith in Jesus Christ. You need to have a whole bunch of characteristics. Doctrinal orthodoxy is another one. And different popes have different skills in these areas. If you look at the last three popes, John Paul II was very much a philosopher. And he was he was a good theologian, but not as sharp as he was a philosopher. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, he was the sharpest theological mind of the 20th century. And so he was a theologian above everything else. Pope Francis had skills as a pastor, but is not as much of a philosopher or a theologian. And so the cardinals are going to be looking for a person who will do a good job and have as many of the different skills as a pope needs as possible. There are betting pools about who's likely to be the next pope. There are websites, like there's a website devoted to the College of Cardinals that not only gives background on all of the College of Cardinals members, but specifically on those that are considered papabile. Also, popes tend to need to be a certain age because you want someone who's young enough to be able to be strong and vigorous in the office, but you don't want someone who's too young, partly because you want the person to have extensive experience before you make them pope. You don't want a newbie who doesn't know how the church works. And because you also don't want an eternal father. You want to leave that role to God, but you don't want to elect someone who's like 30 and then they're going to be on the throne of the pope for 60 years or more, you know. So we're likely to get a new pope who's somewhere in their 70s.
Interesting. Do you have any favorites? I mean, when you talk about these betting pools, you should have seen my text message threads yesterday after we talked about this on the show. Every priest I've ever met, all of my priest friends are like throwing all their suggestions and what they have, which is fun, except for I am not as thoroughly educated about the theological differences between all of these candidates. I have a general knowledge of some of them, but not as in-depth as my knowledge of politics, I have to admit. So who's your favorite? Who would you like to see? Who would be good at this?
Well, who I would like to see, of course, is not who I would predict would get it. Like back when John Paul II died, I had been a fan of Cardinal Ratzinger for ages. I mean, he was my dream pope. And I thought the odds of him getting elected, you know, I couldn't even let myself hope for that. And then he was elected and he became Pope Benedict XVI. And it's like, this is my dream pope. This is so awesome. So it paid off in that case. But like an example of someone who I would like is an African cardinal named Cardinal Sarah. Robert Sarah. He is a sharp theological mind. Has a sharp liturgical mind, meaning he has a very good sense of Christian worship and how it needs to be done. He is more conservative than some, and also he happens to be sub-Saharan African, which I can't wait for the first sub-Saharan African pope because it'll put the kibosh on all this Christianity is white man's religion nonsense. When you have the global leader of Christianity as a black man, or I mean, you know, Asian or whatever, but especially someone from sub-Saharan Africa, it will make a powerful statement that Christianity is a religion for all people, that God loves all his children, and God doesn't care about your skin color any more than he cares about your hair color or your eye color or any other cosmetic differences.
Yeah. And by the way, I feel totally validated by your statement because yesterday when someone asked me during the show who I wanted, I said Cardinal Robert Sarah. So
Yeah.
feel totally if the senior apologist at Catholic Answers says that, good. I must have guessed correctly on that one. So that's who you would like. Who do you
Yeah.
feel are the most likely candidates to get elected? Because there are some numbers, and I've seen a couple of different numbers, so I'm not sure which one is most accurate, of the number of cardinals that Pope Francis put in the College of Cardinals compared with the number who are eligible to vote. I've seen upwards of almost 100 that he appointed compared to 137. Another number said it was about 80. But suffice to say, he's appointed quite a few of those who are eligible to vote.
He has. He's appointed about 3/4 of the College of Cardinals, of the electors. And he's done it in an unusual way that other popes have not done. Traditionally, people like the Archbishop of Paris would be appointed a cardinal because Paris is such an important city historically in the history of the church. But Pope Francis did, similarly, the Archbishop of Los Angeles would typically be a cardinal too. But Pope Francis didn't do that. He wanted to promote people to be cardinals who were from the developing world and from the global south. And that makes sense. You know, historically, originally it was like almost all the cardinals were Italian. And then over the late 20th century, it kind of broadened out to include, you know, other places in Europe and America and things like that. But the global south is still underrepresented. And Pope Francis decided he wanted to work on that issue. And so he appointed, a cardinal from Mongolia and other places that had never had cardinals before. And one of the things about a lot of the people he appointed is they are unknowns. And so they don't have the kind of reputation that a lot of people here in the West, whether that's Europe or America, have had. So they're kind of unknown quantities. Also, people from those countries tend to be more theologically conservative than people from Europe, for example. And on the other hand, Pope Francis himself was more on the progressive side of the spectrum. He wasn't fully progressive, but he was more so than some. And so I think we've got a lot of unknowns in this election. And for that reason, I hesitate to make predictions about what kind of pope or what kind of candidate is going to be elected as the next pope. I know what I would hope, but I don't know what to predict. Unlike bet-in pools in politics, we don't have polling, we don't have feedback to help adjust, who does it look like might get it, because the Cardinals are all sworn to secrecy and don't talk about it publicly. So we've got a lot of unknowns here. One thing I think is likely to happen is the next pope is likely to be quite different from Pope Francis. In at least one respect, which is Pope Francis had some rather sharp elbows. This didn't always come across to the public, but he had a pretty brusque administrative style, if I can put it that way. He didn't have the diplomatic nuances that some other popes like John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger have had. He even talks about that. He's got an autobiography where he talks about how back when he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires, that his autocratic, he uses that word for himself, his autocratic management style caused him problems. Well, that personality characteristic continued when he was Pope. A lot of cardinals saw it and have had the impression from various things cardinals have said that they'd like someone with a gentler touch next time. Pope Francis was able to play to the cameras well. He generated a lot of positive publicity, but there was also a confusion in some of his articulations. There was a kind of sharp-elbowedness in his management style. And I think it's kind of like Doctor Who. Every new Doctor Who is a reaction to the previous Doctor Who. We want someone who's a little different than that. And I think the same thing is going to play out here.
Jimmy, what is your prediction for the name of the next pope? You said you've done extensive research on this.
I did. Back when the last papal election happened, I did a study of all of this, and I discovered a number of interesting things about pope names. In the first millennium, they basically didn't use them. They just used whatever their birth baptismal name was. But in the second millennium, influenced by the model of kings who would take on a new name when they became king, popes started to do the same thing. And initially, they would do it like one of the first was a guy whose birth name was Mercurius, after the pagan god Mercury. Well, he didn't want to be Pope Mercurius, so he took a regnal name for while he was reigning as pope, and this very quickly became the standard in the second millennium. But there are patterns in how the pope names go. One of the patterns is popes tend not to pick the name of their immediate predecessor. It does happen, but it's rare, and it typically is only in times of crisis, like when John Paul I was pope for like a month before he died suddenly, that no one expected. To signal continuity, his successor, John Paul II, took his predecessor's name. But that's rare. Normally, popes don't want to be compared to their immediate predecessor. They don't want to feel like everyone's comparing everything I do to him. I want to be my own man. And so they tend to reach further back in time to pick a name. Lately, we've been in a phase where the popes it seems they've gotten tired of the recent names and they're reaching further back centuries in history, like both Pope John the 23rd, who was active in the 1950s, and Pope Paul VI, who was active in the 1960s. They reached back centuries to get their papal name. And so we seem to be in a period where popes are wanting to shake things up a little bit and not just recycle the same names that have been going around. I predicted in a study I published before Pope Francis was elected that the next pope may reach far back in history for a name, or he may pick a papal name we've never had before, like Francis,
Did
which
you predict that?
I predicted that the new pope may pick a name we've never had before, and that did happen. Privately, I thought of Francis as the lead in opportunity. Unfortunately, I didn't put that part in print.
Dang
Um,
it.
I know, yeah. But it's also possible that could happen now, and we might get a name like Michael, which is a name with a Christian heritage but has never been a papal name. Also, I suspect because society has changed and we don't have kings that are prominent leaders anymore, I suspect the custom of regnal names itself may change in the third millennium. And so I think popes may go back to using their birth name, their baptismal name as pope. So if someone named John is elected pope, he'll just be the next Pope John. Or if someone named Leo is elected pope, he'll just be the next Pope Leo. There are two exceptions, though, to that. If anybody whose birth name is Peter gets elected, he is going to pick a different name as pope because no one wants to, oh, who do you think you are comparing yourself to St. Peter? And the other name that's going to happen for is Jesus, because no one is, oh, you're comparing yourself to Jesus. Any pope who's named Jesus is likely to want to pick a new name for his role as pope.
It shows prudence, the quality we want in a pope.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'll be very interested. And listen, you put it down, you pinned it down, this prediction this time. So if we get a Pope Michael, we'll be able to point to you and say, Jimmy told us.
Yeah.
Remind me of the name, before I let you go, remind me of the name of the book that you mentioned before about the teaching authority of the church.
It's called Teaching with Authority, and it's all about church documents and church teaching and how it all works.
Highly recommend you guys get it. Teaching with Authority by Jimmy Akin. Jimmy, thanks for being on the show. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Liz.